The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Lena Graves had been awake anyway, sitting cross-legged on her apartment floor with sheet music spread around her like fallen leaves, trying to fix a bridge that wasn't working in the third movement of a piece she'd been writing for 8 months. She almost didn't answer. The number was local but unfamiliar, and at that hour, unfamiliar numbers were rarely good news. She answered anyway. "Is this Lena Graves?" A woman's voice, clipped and professional even in the middle of the night. "Yes." "This is County General. You're listed as emergencies contact for a Mr. Theodore Graves." Her father. Her father, who she hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Her father, who had apparently still kept her name on his paperwork. The drive to the hospital took 11 minutes. She knew because she counted every red light, counted every empty intersection. As if the numbers could keep her hands steady on the wheel. He was alive. That was the first thing they told her. He was stable. He'd collapsed at the restaurant, where he still worked as head chef, despite being 62 years old, and despite the fact that his business partner had walked away with everything 6 years ago and left him starting over from scratch. A cardiac event, the doctor said. A younger woman with tired eyes and a lanyard that read DR. Corinna Walsh, they said. Caught quickly, they said. Lena sat in the plastic chairs outside his room and stared at the fluorescent light overhead and thought about the last conversation she'd had with her father. She'd said things she couldn't take back. So had he. That was the thing about grief. It could make you cruel in ways you didn't recognize, until the words were already out of your mouth, already doing their damage. She went in to see him just before dawn. He looked smaller in the hospital bed. That was always the thing that got her, how illness could shrink a person, how a man who had once seemed enormous could suddenly seem made of paper. Theodore Graves had been a force of nature in the kitchen. 27 years building a restaurant from nothing, from a single borrowed card table and a menu with 6 items. She'd grown up in that kitchen, doing homework on a stool while her father moved between stations like a conductor, calling out to his line cooks in a voice that somehow never sounded angry even when it was. His eyes opened when she pulled the chair close. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. "You still have the same number," he said finally. His voice was rough. "You still have me as your emergency contact." He looked away, toward the window where the sky was beginning to go from black to the deep gray that meant morning was coming. Didn't have anyone else to put. That should have made her angrier than it did. Instead, she felt something loosen in her chest. Something she'd been holding for 3 years, maybe longer. "I'm here," she said. That was all. It was enough for now. She stayed until 7, until the day nurse came in to take his vitals and he drifted back to sleep. Then she drove back to her apartment, showered, changed, and went to the one job that actually paid her rent. Studio accompanist at the Harmon Conservatory on the north side of the city. She had a gift. That was what people had been saying about Lena Graves since she was 4 years old, and sat down at her grandmother's upright piano and started picking out melodies by ear. By the time she was 8, she was reading sheet music that 12-year-olds struggled with. By 16, she'd been accepted to a summer program at a conservatory in Boston that accepted fewer than 30 students a year. People used the word prodigy, and she'd learned to flinch at it, because prodigy meant expectation. And expectation meant the specific kind of pressure that could make a person feel like they were constantly failing at something they'd never actually chosen. She'd chosen music anyway. Not because of the gift, or not only because of it, but because it was the only language she'd ever found that could hold the things she couldn't say out loud. Which was why when her father had told her 3 years ago that she was wasting her life, she'd told him that at least she'd built something that was actually hers. She hated that she still remembered his face when she said it. The conservatory was a converted Victorian building on a corner lot, with high ceilings and drafty practice rooms and the permanent smell of rosin and old wood. She had 3 accompaniment sessions that morning, a theory tutorial in the afternoon, and then 2 hours of her own practice time in Studio 4, which was the room with the Steinway she liked best. Slightly more resonant in the middle register than the others, with a sustain pedal that didn't stick. She was 20 minutes into her own work when the door opened. She didn't look up. Students wandered into the wrong rooms sometimes, or colleagues who needed to borrow something. She kept playing. She was working through a passage that kept resisting her, a sequence of intervals that should have resolved naturally, and kept not quite doing it. Mrs. Graves. The voice was not a student. It was the kind of voice that made rooms pay attention, low and controlled, with the quality of someone who didn't raise it often because they'd never needed to. She stopped playing. The man standing in the doorway of Studio 4 was tall, dark-haired, perhaps 40, in a charcoal suit that fit well enough to be custom. She didn't recognize him. She would have remembered. "Mr. Harmon is not available," she said. The conservatory was named after its founder's family. The current director, Owen Harmon, handled all outside inquiries. "I know," the man said. "I'm not here to see Mr. Harmon. I'm here to see you." His name, he told her, was Beckett Solis. He was the artistic director of the Alder Foundation, which was, as Lena was aware, because anyone in serious music was aware, one of the 3 or 4 most significant private arts foundations in the country. They funded concert series, supported young composers, endowed chairs at major schools, and every 3 years gave a commission grant that had the unofficial but widely understood effect of changing the trajectory of the recipient's entire career. Lena had applied for the commission grant the previous year. She had not received it. She said carefully, "I'm listening." Beckett Solis came into the room and sat in the single chair positioned for page-turners, which was the only other seating available. He sat in it like it was exactly where he'd intended to be. "The composer who received the grant last cycle has withdrawn," he said. "Personal reasons. The foundation has decided to extend a secondary offer. Your application was the strongest of the remaining candidates." Lena's hands, still resting on the keys, were very still. "The commission is the same," he continued. 18 months. The premiere would be with the Alder Chamber Orchestra at their spring gala. The support package includes studio time, a stipend, and full recording rights. She knew what it would mean. She had let herself think about it. Once, when she'd submitted the application. Let herself imagine what it would feel like to have 18 months to write something, without worrying about whether she could make rent, without splitting her attention between her own work and the work of everyone else she was helping along. She had then carefully put that imagining away, because imagining things too clearly before they happened seemed to her like a way of setting yourself up for a very particular kind of grief. "Why come in person?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. He was clearly someone who kept a very controlled face, but enough that she noticed. "The foundation likes to have a preliminary conversation before extending a formal offer," he said, "to make sure the candidate's current project is something we can support. And if it's not, then we'd discuss adjustments." He paused. "Or we'd look at the next candidate on the list." She looked at him steadily. "That's very direct." "I find that directness saves time." "What do you want to know about the project?" He asked good questions. She hadn't expected that. Had expected, maybe, the kind of vague artistic interest that people performed when they wanted to seem engaged, but didn't actually know what they were engaging with. Instead, he asked about structure, about the relationship between the movements, about her influences and which of them she was deliberately arguing against. He asked about the bridge she'd been struggling with when she mentioned it, and why she thought it kept resisting her. "Because the emotional logic isn't right yet," she said. "The third movement is supposed to be about a kind of complicated piece, not resolved, not clean, but forward-facing, and the bridge keeps wanting to go backward. I keep writing grief into it when I should be writing something else." He was quiet for a moment. "What should you be writing?" "I don't know yet. That's the problem." He nodded once, as if that was a satisfactory answer. Before he left, he gave her a card with a number and told her the formal offer would come by email within 48 hours. He paused at the door. "Mrs. Graves," he said, "for what it's worth, the committee felt that your application was the strongest one submitted. Not the runner-up strongest, the strongest overall. There was a disagreement about whether the work was ready for the scale of the premiere. That's why you didn't receive the initial offer. She absorbed this. And now, he said, the committee would like to see whether the work and the composer are both ready. He left. She sat at the Steinway for a long time without playing anything. She went back to the hospital that evening. Her father was more alert, sitting up against the pillows, watching a cooking competition program with the sound very low. He turned it off when she came in, which she understood was a gesture. They talked, really talked, for the first time in 3 years, not about what had happened between them, not yet, but about smaller things. She told him about the conservatory, about the students who were actually talented, and the ones who weren't but worked hard enough to make up for it. He told her about the restaurant, about a new sous chef he'd hired who was 24 and already better at butchering than most people twice her age. The chest thing, he said eventually. This isn't my first. He stopped, started again. This happened 6 months ago too. Smaller. I didn't tell anyone. She looked at him. I didn't want to be a burden, he said. And his voice, on those last 3 words, was the voice of a man who had spent his entire life providing and could not tolerate the possibility of needing. You would have called someone, she said. If it had been serious, I didn't have anyone to call. That was what undid her. Not the cardiac event, not 3 years of silence, not even the memory of what she'd said the last time they spoke. It was that. The simple, terrible fact that her father had been alone and frightened and hadn't called her because he'd thought she wouldn't come. I came, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. You came, he agreed. She didn't cry in front of him. She went to the hallway and stood by a window that looked out over the parking structure and let herself have 2 minutes. And then she went back in and sat down, and they watched the cooking competition with the sound on, and her father critiqued every decision the contestants made. And she argued with him about half of them, just to give him something to push back against, and it felt like something ancient and almost forgotten, the specific rhythm of being his daughter. The formal offer from the Alder Foundation came the next morning as promised. She read it 3 times. Then she called her best friend Zinnia Park, who was a cellist and the most grounded person Lena knew, and read it to her over the phone. Say yes, Zinnia said, before she'd even finished. I haven't told you the terms. I don't care about the terms. Say yes. She emailed her acceptance from the parking lot of the hospital, sitting in her car before going in for her afternoon visit. Then she went upstairs and told her father. He was quiet for a long moment. I didn't know you were still composing, he said. I never stopped. I thought, he shook his head. I thought when you took the job at the conservatory. The job at the conservatory is how I paid rent. The composing is what I actually do. Another silence. This one felt different, softer somehow, more careful. Tell me about it, he said. The piece. So she did. She sat in the plastic chair and told him about the 6 movements, about the way the first movement was almost aggressive in its energy, and then the second one pulled everything into something quieter and more uncertain, and the way the whole middle section was essentially a long argument with itself about whether or not to give in to despair, and then the third movement, the one with the bridge that kept going wrong, which was supposed to be the answer, the complicated, imperfect, forward-facing answer. Her father listened the way he always had completely. It was one of the things she'd forgotten about him, how fully he could give his attention when he chose to. The bridge, he said when she'd finished. You said it keeps wanting to go backward. Yes. Why is that wrong? She opened her mouth and then closed it. Maybe it goes backward because you can't get to that complicated piece without going through the grief one more time, he said. Maybe the grief isn't done yet. Maybe it needs one more pass. She sat with that for a long moment. When did you become a music critic? She said. I've always been your audience, he said simply. She drove home that evening and went straight to the piano and opened the score for the third movement and sat staring at the bridge. Her father's words moved around in her head. Maybe the grief isn't done yet. Maybe it needs one more pass. She started playing, slowly at first, feeling her way through the familiar problem, and then, there, There it was, not a different solution. The same passage, but with one more descent before the ascent, one more pulling back before the moving forward, not abandoning the grief. Carrying it, she played it through twice, then 3 times. Each time it felt more right, not resolved, not clean, but true. The emotional logic was finally correct. She sat back and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and looked at the ceiling of her apartment, at the water stain in the corner that she'd been meaning to deal with for 2 years. And she thought about how the strangest things could break open, the things you'd been trying to pry apart for months. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unfamiliar number. And then she recognized it as the one from the card Beckett Solis had given her. "The committee looks forward to working with you, Miss Graves. We think the piece will be something worth hearing." She looked at the text for a long moment. Then she set her phone face down on the piano bench and picked up her pencil and started writing the bridge, the real bridge, the one that finally made sense, into the score. She worked until 2 in the morning. When she finally stopped, her hand was cramped and her back ached, and she was more awake than she'd been in months. Her father was discharged 3 days later. She drove him home, to the small house in the same neighborhood where she'd grown up, smaller than she remembered, the kitchen still smelling like the particular combination of coffee and dried herbs that she associated with early mornings before school. He was quieter than usual in the car, which she understood was about pride and about the difficulty of being in the passenger seat when you were someone who had always driven. She helped him carry his bag inside. She looked around the kitchen while he sat down at the table with the look of a man who was very glad to be in his own chair. "I'll come by on Saturday," she said. "You don't have to." "I know." He looked at her and she could see him working through something. "The piece," he said. "When it premieres, will you tell me? I'd like to be there." She had not expected that. She stood in his kitchen doorway and felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for immediately. Something that was grief and relief and a complicated piece of time all at once. "I'll get you a ticket," she said. Front row. She drove home the long way, through the old neighborhood, past the building where the restaurant used to be. Closed for 2 years now, the windows papered over. She didn't stop. She'd stopped once before, a few years ago, and it had only made things worse. But she drove past it slowly, the way you did past something you needed to acknowledge. 6 months later, the bridge in the 3rd movement was the thing that every reviewer mentioned. She read the reviews from her father's kitchen table the morning after the premiere, the 2 of them drinking coffee in the early light, the newspaper spread between them, like they used to do when she was a teenager, and he was teaching her that it mattered to pay attention to the world. He read slower than she did, and kept stopping to ask her to explain musical terms, which she did, which led to arguments about whether certain descriptions were accurate, which led to him telling a story about a musician who'd eaten at the restaurant once and been absolutely insufferable about it, which led to her laughing so hard she spilled her coffee. Outside, the city was doing what cities do, moving and grinding and humming along in its 10,000 separate concerns. Inside, the kitchen was warm, the coffee was good. She had spent 18 months writing a piece about complicated peace, about what it looked like after grief, after failure, after the kind of silence that hardens into distance. She had written it without knowing whether she was describing something she'd already found or something she was still trying to get to. Sitting across from her father, in the kitchen that smelled like coffee and dried herbs, watching him read her name in the newspaper with the very specific expression of a man who was proud and didn't quite know how to say so, she thought she finally had the answer. It looked like this, imperfect and ongoing and worth every pass through the grief to get here. She picked up her pencil from the table. She always had one with her, and on the corner of the newspaper margin, she wrote down a single phrase that had just come to her, the first phrase of what might become the next piece. She was already ready to begin.